Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Travis Major. I'm the Director of Graduate Admissions here at the Schar School of Policy and Government. It's a real pleasure to have you all have an opportunity to engage in a graduate level course discussion with one of our most recent and notable additions to our faculty, Andrew McCabe. We're going to jump right into it in just a minute, but a couple of housekeeping notes before we start. One is we certainly do want to get some of your questions, and we will field those towards the end. So as you have questions during the discussion, please put those questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. Please put it in Q&A, and then I'll be looking there to send some questions to Andrew towards the end of the session. Now, we are at a hard stop at 7 p.m. Andrew has a TV appearance coming up this evening, so unfortunately we can't run late, but we're gonna run a tight ship tonight. And then the other housekeeping item I'd like to mention is that for those of you who are still thinking about or in the progress of applying to graduate study for fall 21, the Schar School of Policy and Government's master's degree application is still open and will be open through January 15th. We have a large amount of scholarship money specifically set aside for students interested in national security studies. We would love for you to be able to take advantage for that. So if you're interested in moving forward with an application, please do that. And as an added bonus, attendees this evening will have a waived application fee. So with that, I'm happy to turn the floor over to Andrew.
Thank you, Travis, very much. Really appreciate that introduction and for taking care of the technical side of our program tonight, which I am completely unqualified to handle by myself. So I appreciate that. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, prospective students, interested, possible students, anybody who's thinking about jumping off the cliff into a master's program at the Schar School. It's my pleasure to talk to you tonight and to discuss a little bit, to give you kind of an overview of the class that I have just finished teaching, my first semester teaching at Schar, and it is my class in National Security Law and Policy. So I'd just like to walk through a little bit of kind of how the class is structured and what the goals are for the learning experience. And I'll talk to you a little bit about my own experience prior to this adventure in teaching to kind of set some context for why I think this is such an important and compelling subject to discuss each week with my students. So I think it's most important first to mention that one of the things that I appreciate the most about George Mason University and the Schar School in particular is that in addition to having just first-rate national and internationally known academics, folks who have spent their lives and their careers studying these issues that are of great importance to us all, they also have folks like me. There are practitioners who serve as professors and visiting professors, as I do, at the Schar School. And although we don't have the same esteemed academic background maybe that some of our colleagues do, we bring to the teaching experience our careers and our work experience, our time serving in government, in the private sector, all around our nation's capital in the Northern Virginia area. And to try to kind of convey those unique experiences to you as you pursue, at the Schar School, of course, your interests in policy and government. So that's really how I see my role at the Schar School. It's to try to cover topics that I think are compelling and interesting and important, but to also infuse those discussions with my own personal experiences engaging in the national security policy process. So that's been the course that I taught this year, this semester, the National Security Law and Policy. My goals for the course were really to help students understand first the sources of national security law. What are those key sources that give our presidents and our Congress and our courts the ability to make decisions that craft policy? I'm talking, of course, about the Constitution, about key pieces of legislation, and of course, the court's ability to conduct constitutional review of the administration and Congress's actions. I also want students to be able to engage in conversations that will give them the skills to analyze the issues around national security. it's important to understand the many different impacts, the many different influences on presidents, on administrations, and on Congress in deciding national security issues. There are many different players in this field. There are many places around our Capitol in which key decisions are made that have a massive impact on national security issues. Most of those decisions and most of those conversations come together in the sit room, in the White House, in the National Security Council process. Through a series of meetings and different sub-processes, those issues get teed up through ultimately the Deputies Committee, the Principals Committee, and then in National Security Council meetings with the President, where they present issues for decision. So through my own experience and having attended many, many discussions and meetings in that room and in the processes that lead up to it, I try to give my students a window into how those conversations take place, to actually put you in that room, which I believe is really the crucible of our national security policy process. That is where the sausage gets made. That's where the agencies come together. That's where they advocate for their own individual perspectives and agendas on the national security process. That's where national security advisors sort through the different options and consider what to forward on to the president, what to recommend to presidents in terms of steps to take on literally issues of life and death and national security. It's a fascinating, bedeviling experience, and it's one that I try to give my students a bit of a kind of look behind the curtain as to how some of those conversations play out. So the personal experience that I bring to the class is, of course, mostly from my career in the FBI. Of course, before the FBI, I went to law school and practiced law in private practice for 3 years before I came into the FBI in 1996. Once in the FBI, I spent my first half of my career in the New York City field office, working and supervising investigations of organized crime, actually Russian organized crime exclusively. It was an absolutely great experience and one that I wouldn't change for the world. In 2006, I came to Washington to work at FBI headquarters, and that's really when I made the jump into national security investigations. Started out in the counterterrorism division, and then was fortunate to serve a number of different roles in the FBI's counterterrorism division. Ultimately, I led the division as the assistant director, and then had a few other jobs in the FBI as I reached the end of my career and served as the deputy director for 2 years. A few months towards the end, I served as the acting director after Jim Comey got fired. And then I left the Bureau under somewhat adverse circumstances in January of 2018. But I'll let you ask all kinds of questions about that later if you like. But it was really those last 5 or 6 years or so that I spent a lot of time representing the FBI and the Department of Justice in those very conversations in the Situation Room in the White House around such issues as national counterterrorism policy, our approach to investigating and finding, locating, and resolving terrorist threats overseas in the many different ways that our government can resolve terrorist threats overseas, watching how the national security lawyers and the national security advisor to the president grappled with things like the legal authority to pursue covert action or targeted killings, how to think about protecting the homeland against threats, both foreign and domestic. So it was really the last 5 or 6 years or so of my career that I spent most of my time focused on those issues. And so those are some of the issues that I bring to the class. The course requirements, just to give you an idea of how the course is structured and the sorts of things that I look for. There are weekly readings, of course. We have 2 required texts. We read the National Security Enterprise, which is a great textbook written by authors George and Rishikoff, and it talks about essentially the different players in the national security enterprise in our country. There's different chapters on each one of the agencies and how they're structured, how they're organized, what their leadership is like. And it really gives you a great insight into what it's like working in that environment. And then, of course, we read Charlie Savage's notable book, Power Wars, which is an in-depth look at many of these exact national security discussions and dilemmas faced by both the George Bush administration and Barack Obama's administration. So there's a lot of conversations about surveillance and the use of warrantless surveillance, the way that we worked through issues like Guantanamo Bay and trying to reduce the population, the prison population in Guantanamo, and how to resolve the detainee and interrogation issues that came out of the detention and interrogation program. So really good stuff. And Charlie Savage covers those topics with incredible detail in Power Wars. Of course, each week I add to that selected cases, Supreme Court case law. There are speeches that I've asked my class to read. There are executive orders. There are choice pieces of legislation, things of that nature. It is not a law school class, so don't be afraid of that. We're not. It's not a steady diet of Supreme Court cases that you have to, get grilled about the Socratic method in class or anything like that. But of course, acknowledging and understanding those sources of authority to make national security decisions is an important piece, and so that requires some study of the law. The class also, each week I post, I have a discussion board that we use on the Blackboard function here at George Mason, and I post 2 questions based on that week's reading. So all the students are required to answer those questions before class. And then of course I require participation, right? These topics are, the fun in these topics is talking about them and discussing them. There are no easy or clear answers to many of these questions. And so the best part for me, and I hope for the students, are the hours that we spend talking about these dilemmas, weighing the pros and cons, thinking about the risk and reward balance in each one of these potential options. And so I require my students to really engage in class. I expect to see every student contribute to the discussion in each class. As you might expect, that's pretty much how the grades are pulled together. 10% is the homework, which is the answering the questions. 10% is class participation. 30% of the grade is based on the midterm evaluation, which is a kind of a 4 short essay question test. And then half of the grade is the final paper. So this is the piece that we really spend the semester building up to. I have each student writes a notional decisional document, so modeled after the sorts of memos that the national security staff in the White House composes on each issue and ultimately are given to the president. These memos kind of compress the whole policy process up to that point. The discussions, the debates around a particular issue, they ultimately boil down to 2 or 3 or maybe 4 different action options that the president should consider. And then they make a recommendation to the president as to which options the council thinks the president should best pursue. So by the end of the class, you will be so familiar with this process and what's necessary, you'll be able to write a decisional kind of a notional NSC decisional memo for the president. So I'm actually in the middle of grading those this week. I just got them on Sunday night. They were due. I'm about 2/3 of the way done with the stack of papers. So that's good progress. Okay, so I'm going to move on now. And I should also say, this is the first time I've ever done any sort of class over Zoom. So if it's, a red hot mess, I apologize for that. I've made full disclosure. I am a first-time teacher, but of course I taught my class in person. We decided to brave the COVID threat and actually meet every week. The class met on Tuesdays from 4:30 to just about 7:30 at night. And so this is the first time that I've done a longer kind of class over Zoom. And now I've lost it. Here we go. There we go. You're back. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about those sources of national security law. And as I say to my class every single week, All things start with the Constitution, right? The United States Constitution is the source of all legal authority in this realm. And so you cannot spend too much time thinking about and reading and kind of really going over in great detail the Constitution and how that from the Constitution, presidents derive their authority to conduct war, to sign treaties, to propose legislation. And it's really, that's where it's the greatest source of national security power in this country. And that comes from the Constitution, right? Article 1 gives the president, I'm sorry, not Article 1, Article 2 gives the president the commander-in-chief authority, which is probably the most often cited authority by every administration to justify the steps that they are taking in this area. And of course, the infamous take care clause in Article 2, which gives the president the authority to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So as Congress passes laws that impact national security, like, for instance, Congress passes laws that restrict the way that detainees can be taken from Guantanamo Bay and brought to the United States. That cannot be done by the Department of Defense anymore because of a congressional law. It is the president's authority and responsibility to see that those laws are faithfully executed. Similarly, Article 1 of the Constitution tells us about the Congress's authority in the realm of national security. So what can Congress do? Well, of course, it's up to Congress to declare war. There is no greater act of national security authority than the declaration of war and the prosecution of a war against our enemies. And that, of course, comes from Congress's authority. They can grant letters of marque and reprisal. They can make rules concerning captures on land and on water. They very significantly raise and support the armed forces. So it is Congress's authority and responsibility to ensure that we are providing for the military. And of course, in the same way that the president enjoys a certain amount of responsibility under the take care clause, Congress has the necessary and proper clause. Congress must make all laws that are necessary and proper for executing any power conferred by the Constitution. So when you consider that the president has the commander-in-chief authority to direct and deploy the military, Congress is required to make all the laws that are necessary and proper to ensure that the president can execute his authority. So that could include things like funding the military, right? That could include passing laws that create or get rid of the military drafts. There's lots of different ways that Congress is involved in the national security process. And of course, we have a third branch, a third center of gravity in our constitutional democracy, and that is the judiciary. There are some judicial powers expressed in the Constitution, not so many that are explicitly directed towards national security issues, but it is the judiciary and particularly the Supreme Court's responsibility to declare laws constitutional or unconstitutional that has really, that's the bedrock of judicial oversight over these significant national security decisions. There is no better case to talk about when we're thinking about the power and the responsibility of the Supreme Court than the name you've all heard, I'm sure, many, many times before, Marbury versus Madison. So this is the first case that we talk about in my class. And with all the cases, I try to really bring in the story behind the case, because I remember from my own days in law school that it was like really hard for me to remember the details of cases or really anything in my life unless I put it in the context of a story. Like I can remember any story that someone tells me, but I frequently cannot even remember like what's on my own calendar. So like, details and facts without that context of a plot are very hard for me to remember. So I try to teach my class along those lines as well. So Marbury versus Madison is a great story. It has to do with the presidential election of 1800, in which, of course, Thomas Jefferson defeats the incumbent John Adams. On his way out the door, Adams decides he's going to saddle Jefferson with a bunch of Federalist Party loyalists. So on his last few days in office, he signs dozens, I think 60 or so, appointments to judge and justice of the peace positions. These are infamously referred to as the midnight judges. On March 3rd, the Senate confirms, and Secretary of State John Marshall signs, seals, and attempts to deliver these commissions. Marshall is leaving his post at state because he has recently been appointed Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So he asks his brother, James Markham Marshall, to make the deliveries. On March 4th, Thomas Jefferson is sworn in, and he instructs his new Secretary of State, James Madison, to refrain from delivering the remaining commissions. That's what gets us to the situation where William Marbury does not physically receive his commission as a justice of the peace. So Marbury files a lawsuit and he asks for a writ of mandamus. A writ of mandamus is basically an order that the government directs, one in which the court directs a part of the government to take some official action. He asks for a writ like that, directing the State Department to compel the State Department to deliver him his commission so he can begin his term as a justice of peace. So here we are into the decision itself, and I will spare you the brilliance and the legal majesty of Marshall's decision in Marbury versus Madison, but he breaks it out very simply. Does Marbury have the right to the commission? Yes, he does. He does have the legal right to the commission. If he has that legal right, is there a remedy available to him? Yes. Marshall determines if you have a legal right, there must be a remedy to protect that right. And in this case, the determination is that the writ of mandamus is the correct remedy. So if that is the correct remedy for this legal right, the question then becomes, can the Supreme Court issue it? Can the judicial branch command the executive to take an action? And here's where Marshall gets really cagey. He lays out the terms of the court's original and appellate jurisdiction. Marbury, in Marbury's case, he argues that Section 13 of the Judiciary Act gives the Supreme Court the authority to issue writs of mandamus. So Congress, in the Judiciary Act, essentially gave the court the authority to issue writs of mandamus. While Marshall finds that the writ is the proper remedy, he also determines that it is not that in granting the court the authority to do that, Congress has overstepped their constitutional authority. Marshall determines that the Constitution does not give Congress the ability to convey additional authority to the judicial branch through legislation. And by doing so, he strikes down the Judiciary Act and he refuses to grant Marbury the relief that he seeks. It's a brilliant decision because it enables both political sides walk away with a little bit of something. Nobody gets completely shut down, right? So the Federalists, Marbury's legal right to the commission is recognized. They say it was a lawful appointment, even though it was done at midnight on the day before he left. The writ should be the proper remedy. And Jefferson, of course, doesn't get saddled with William Marbury, who would be a political opponent of his, and somebody that he didn't want to have to deal with. And the Supreme Court walks away with having articulated themselves in the position of the final arbiter of constitutionality. The significance of the Marbury versus Madison decision, it is the Supreme Court staking out this territory and basically saying, we will be the final judge of all things constitutional and unconstitutional. And when we so find that something is unconstitutional, we can strike down that law and eliminate it. That is what puts the Supreme Court right in the middle of so many of these incredibly important national security decisions, telling the Bush administration, for instance, that detainees in Guantanamo Bay actually have habeas corpus constitutional rights, and they must be put through some sort of a due process to determine whether or not they're being held lawfully. I mean, there are major decisions that the Supreme Court has weighed in on and really changed the path of US national security. So that's where we start the course, talking about those sources of law. We very quickly then get into the national security process itself, how it works, the significance of the national security advisor. So the president's most trusted, most relied upon voice in the national security kind of debates, right? That national security advisor, and the impact that different national security advisors have had on different presidents. Famously, President Kennedy had McGeorge Bundy. Bundy created the model of what is referred to as the honest broker national security advisor. So, of course, stung by his failure in the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Kennedy realizes that he has to become a voracious consumer of national security information, and he needs an advisor who will tell it to him straight, exactly like who's angling for what and which options does he think are the most important. And McBundy embraces that role. He thinks of himself as the final deliverer of reality and information and intelligence to the president. So he doesn't align himself with a particular philosophy or theory or approach to foreign policy, but rather sees himself as the president's closest advisor on these issues. And that's kind of what comes to define that honest broker role that we see Bundy play. Probably the best alternative example to Bundy is, of course, the relationship between Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. Kissinger is the anti-Bundy. He is a strong policy advocate, right? Kissinger is brilliant. He has an incredible command of the issues. He is an incredible consumer of intelligence. Kissinger has a reputation in the White House for interacting with everyone. He can't get his hands on enough information at any given time. He is a micromanager of the National Security Council and a micromanager of his president, President Nixon. But Kissinger brings to those conversations with President Nixon a decided focus and an agenda, and uses his position of leverage with the president to pursue a national security agenda. And of course, you look at the things that were accomplished under that partnership, specifically probably China, the opening of China, the way they struggled with the Vietnam War. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. It's a fascinating area to kind of get into. Each one of these relationships, I think, is worthy of an entire semester's worth of study. Of course, we don't have time for that over the course of the semester, and certainly don't have time for that tonight. So we walk through a bunch of these different relationships, and the point is to try to talk about when you think about influences on the national security policy process and influences on presidential decision-making about national security policy, you have to first start with the personalities, the leadership figures that are around the president, and the national security advisor is, of course, one of the most significant. The next place that we focus on in class is on the role of the agencies in the national security process. So there are, of course, some big dogs at the table fighting it out on any given issue. So we spend a lot of time in class talking about the Department of Defense, the Department of State, Department of Homeland Security, my former agency, the FBI, of course, part of the Department of Justice. And of course, there are many other players in the policy process, CIA, the intelligence community as a whole, the DNI, and we think about and discuss how different leadership styles in the roles of agency heads have impacted the foreign policy process through history. focusing just on secretaries of defense. It's incredible when you think about the impact that someone like Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense from 1961 to 1968, the Department of Defense that we know today is the McNamara Department of Defense, right? Centralized leadership, complete control over the services. McNamara himself has often been described as a rejectionist Secretary of Defense, right? He saw it his way, and anyone who saw it any other way was wrong. McNamara didn't really have any interest in working with the interagency. He had the biggest budget. He had the most people. He had the most important issues on his plate, like the Vietnam War. And he saw himself as dealing essentially directly with the president. I mean, he was not someone who approached his job through like a coalition building or a collaborative model, as some secretaries of defense that we see later did. Donald Rumsfeld, a similar approach to his role. Caspar Weinberger, also a rejectionist, kind of a go it your own way. Dick Cheney, from 89 to 93, very different. What's been described as a participant style Secretary of Defense, worked positive interagency relationships, things like that. So we spent a lot of time in the class talking about influences on the national security policy process, and these leadership figures, heads of agencies, national security advisors, are really foremost in that list. The next thing we start talking about is the impact of events on national security decisions. And no event in our recent history has had as much significance to this country's trajectory in national security than 9/11. So we spent an entire class talking about the impact for now nearing decades that the events on 9/11, the attacks on 9/11 had on major national security decisions. I like to start the class with talking about how 9/11 affected our own lives personally. So we go around the room, and people really contributed some incredible stories about where they were on 9/11 and their memories of that day and how it changed their thoughts about the world, about politics, about their own safety. I talk about my own experience. I was an agent in New York on 9/11. I was a member of the SWAT team in the New York City field office. It's very quickly detailed out with the SWAT team to provide security to our office, which had to relocate because our building was contaminated with the air was very dangerous down in Lower Manhattan. With the fires burning over at the World Trade Center site. So we spend some time kind of touching in on the personal impact that event had on us. And I think that helps to understand like that same sort of personal impact was experienced by people making really impactful decisions about national security, like the president. I mean, I don't think there's any better example than President Bush in his own experience, starting the day reading books to a kindergarten class in Florida and ending the day trying to figure out how to respond to the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil in our history. We talk a lot about the legal challenges and advances that we made after 9/11. We talk a lot about the Patriot Act, expanded use of FISA for counterterrorism cases, roving wiretaps, delayed notification of surveillance, all these kind of tactical improvements that came with the Patriot Act. And we talk about the more controversial decisions that came from came after the Patriot Act. So we spend an entire class, not the same 9/11 class, but a class later in the semester, talking about surveillance and the decisions that led to the terrorist surveillance programs like Stellar Wind and warrantless surveillance of Americans. We walk through all of the DOJ opinions that first authorized that activity and then ultimately, did a 180 and said that we should not be in that place. We talk about how Congress kind of consistently tried to take imperfect decisions and abuses of the law and essentially fix them with legislation through things like the FISA Amendments Act and other acts of Congress. So there's really so much important material to get into that all is derivative in one way or another from 9/11. 9/11 is it's really the catalyst of so much of our national security future. Talk about the creation of DHS with the Homeland Security Act in 2002. And of course, we do some significant reading from the 9/11 Commission report, which is right there on my bookshelf. If any real aficionados like me recognize it. It is one of the most important reports, I think, ever completed in the history of this country. It is a work of soaring detail, and I think it's worthy read for any American anytime. So if you have time this summer and you feel like going deep on 9/11, I can't recommend anything any higher than that. So we spent a lot of time focusing on the recommendations from the 9/11 report, the pursuit of terrorist sanctuaries, defeating the ideology. These are things that, sounded unique and new to us then and are really just a part of the way that we think about confronting the terrorist threat as a nation today. So anyway, a lot of great stuff to cover there. All right, I want to get to some of your questions. So I'm just going to kind of touch on some of these things very quickly. And we go from that point, really having spent the first half of the semester talking about the influences on the policy process of the process itself, the personalities, leadership style of presidents and the NSAs, impact of the agencies, and then the impact of events. The second half of the class, we really go deep on a bunch of different fascinating issues. So the use of criminal tools, criminal authorities under the law to address national security issues, like not something that you might think about instinctively, but has been a roiling area of controversy in the pursuit of the counterterrorist mission for many years. We originally didn't think about putting terrorist subjects on trial, Article 3 federal court trials here in the United States initially. Ultimately, we devised a process, a legally effective process which protected folks' constitutional rights and was also able to deliver justice here in our federal court system. And then we drifted away from that, approach under the Trump administration. So there's really controversial issues. There are very strong opinions on both sides of that issue. I don't think there was a single topic that motivated the class more directly than our discussion of the use of criminal tools combating domestic terrorism. So we spent a whole class talking about the investigation of domestic terrorist organizations by the FBI, the potential involvement of the Department of Homeland Security in issues like surveilling domestic extremists. It's a really hot issue right now. And of course, talking about whether or not our government should pursue a federal criminal law with criminal penalties for domestic terrorist activity. Very strong opinions on both sides of that debate. We read some of the foremost legal scholars, Mary McCord, Jason Blazekis, others who don't believe that such a law is necessary. So that was a great topic to discuss and one that many students came back to and relooked at in the context of their final paper. We spent an entire class on the authority and pursuit of covert action. What is it that enables presidents to direct the military to conduct activities that our country will deny, to conduct foreign policy actions in a covert manner? Where does that authority come from? How is it executed? It's a tough topic to talk about because, there are, your first thought might be, well, there's not a lot of things that we can discuss. There's certainly a lot of things that I can't discuss on that night, but there are some really good examples that have been declassified over time, and there's some really good writing on this topic, and it's kind of a look into part of our national security process that maybe most people aren't familiar with. We spent an entire class talking about detention and interrogation of terrorist subjects, how that has changed over the years, the Supreme Court cases that have over time been finding and granting more and more constitutional rights to terrorism detainees held in Guantanamo Bay or at detention facilities overseas in places like Afghanistan. Fascinating area of the law and a really controversial subject. And there are folks who believe very strongly that terrorists should not be treated like common criminals and should not be. That's my dog who's walking in the background there. Sorry for the distraction. And then there are those of us who believe that we should conduct ourselves as a nation always in accordance with the Constitution and with the values and the ethics that come along with our commitment to our constitutional principles. So we had some great discussions around that. And finally, we wrap it up with a class on targeted killings. What is the authority that enables our government to pursue individual threats overseas? We spend some time talking about the Obama administration's approach to kind of changing the ground rules of that program and then acknowledging it publicly in a speech that President Obama gave at the National Defense University. So really fascinating area of the law, and it gets us deep into terrorism issues, that's like going home for me. So that's always a favorite part of the class. So that's probably enough. I'll switch over to taking some questions. I hope that gives you an idea of the sort of topics that we cover in the class and the kind of, passion, I guess, and interest that I have for these topics and what makes it so fascinating to kick this stuff around, really talk through the issues and prepare to write on them, which is even better. So Travis, you got some questions for me?
I do. And for those of you that have been holding back, now is the time. So please, using the Q&A function here in the session, enter your question, and we will try to get to as many as possible. We start off with something you began with. You were talking about the grading you were doing right now. Mia had a question. Do students get to decide the topic of their decisional memo, and how long do memos tend to be?
Great question. So yes, every student gets to decide the topic. I proposed 4 topics as suggestions, but I gave them the opportunity to pick a different one if they wanted. They're just required, if they pick a different, not one of the 4 suggested topics, but a different topic, they have to kind of run it past me first so I can make sure that they're not, charging off in a direction that will not be productive. The memos are, the suggested length is 10 to 15 pages. I will not read over 15 pages. I cannot digest quite that many really super long. You got to put a limit on it because there's really you could talk about this stuff forever. And of course, decisional memos have to be concise. They have to be clear. They have to be direct. And so I try to keep those requirements in mind. So they're about 15. Everybody comes in around 15 pages. I really feel strongly about giving people clear guidance in terms of what I expect from the class generally, but also on the specific assignments. And so for the final paper, I think the rubric I gave out was about 4 or 5 pages long. So it's very detailed. I also am available to discuss anything really at any time. I've done a bunch of individual one-on-one Zoom sessions with students as they've had questions about their topic or struggling with the paper in one way or another. I'm always available and happy to engage one-on-one to help people work through those things.
Great. And it looks like a related question from Sean. Are there memos available online that mirror the type of NSC style product that you require in your course?
There are a few, as you would expect. These are like highly classified documents, so it's tough to find ones that have been declassified recently. There are some older memos, and each memo is a little bit different. So there are some that are instructive, but not like perfect analogies to what we're doing. But honestly, I think by the end of the class, we have been through this process of like discussing the issues so many times. I think people were pretty clear. I've been very impressed with the ones I've read so far. I have 15 students in the class this semester. I've read 10 of the papers so far. And yeah, I think they're going really well. I'm impressed with their scope and their creativity and the way that they're addressing the issues. So it's good. It's all good.
Okay. You accidentally sort of also just answered another question Alicia was asking.
Awesome.
About how many students are there in the class. You had just said it was 15. Could you talk a little bit about what kind of discussions that type of class? Now, what I can do within the Schar School, classes are capped at hard cap 25 to 30. Most of your elective courses, such as the one that Andrew teaches, are going to be less than that. We recognize that, you know, the discussion is an absolutely critical piece of
That's
the
right.
learning.
That's right.
So can you tell us a little bit about what kind of discussions happen in your classroom? What kind of discussions you try to facilitate between yourself and among students?
Sure. Yeah. So we were capped at 15. And I think part of that, most of that really was because George Mason had some very serious and necessary COVID restrictions on in-person learning. So the room sat, I think, 40, and to accommodate the social distancing between students, they limited the number to 15 for this class, which was really perfect because at 15, we all really were able to kind of get to know each other. And certainly by the second or third class, there was this real spirit of, contribution. Everybody was kind of chiming in. It was the hardest part for me was being able to kind of moderate and give everyone the same opportunity, because I really want to hear from all the voices. So, and I approached the class as old habits, I guess, are hard to break having spent many years doing hundreds of interviews. As an FBI agent, you walk into each kind of situation like that. Your first thing that you try to do is like build rapport, right? You try to kind of establish a sense of trust between the people that you're talking to. You try to kind of get people's defenses down and get them to open up and feel comfortable sharing. And so I would do that every week. I would use I would come in with I would call it the opening round. And so I'd have some crazy question that I'd make everybody answer, like, what's the first place you're going to visit on vacation once the COVID restrictions are revoked? And so we just went around the room and people just started telling me these hilarious stories about places they like or didn't like to visit. I was shocked to find like 3 people in the class said they hated Paris. I'm like, who hates Paris? It's like one of the nicest places on earth. But in any case, I just give it as an example. Like I find that kind of warming up the conversation with something totally off topic is really an effective way to get people to kind of, feel comfortable hearing their own voice in that room and talking about what they think. So that's how I approached it.
Great, thank you. I have a question from Samuel here. With the Biden administration pulling out of Afghanistan, do you see the administration expanding the use of covert actions and targeted killings abroad?
It's a great question. It's certainly possible. I think probably the nearer term issue for the administration is going to be figuring out how to continue conducting effective surveillance on our terrorist threats without having a major military presence in Afghanistan. So that's going to require negotiating very complicated and quiet agreements and arrangements with neighboring countries. It's going to require technical surveillance means deployed at different places. And then, of course, depending on how much visibility we have into those areas where our terrorist threats emanate from, that will ultimately determine what sort of policies, be they covert action or kinetic action and that kind of thing. So that's kind of, I would think, a decision that's down the road for the administration. But you need to have some really incredibly clear and definitive information and intelligence before you can think about taking action like that. So I think that establishing that intelligence collection is going to be their nearer term challenge.
Great. Related to that last point you made about the necessity of good quality intelligence collection, what are there someone's asking about resources, things they can read on their own, whether they're books, articles, or some thought leaders who should be followed, who sort of, where can people find sort of the leading thoughts and the best writing right now about the use of covert action in intelligence?
Well, I always recommend, there's a couple of really good blogs that I'm sure you've heard of where I go routinely and find kind of thoughtful, thought-provoking writings on topics like that. Lawfare is it's the Brookings Institute blog. Lawfare does a great job. There's such smart people that write for Lawfare, and the topics are really kind of across the spectrum. So you can certainly find things there along those lines that you'd be interested in reading. Just Security is another great blog that covers all sorts of implications of national security decisions. And again, some like really esteemed former practitioners and academics write for both of those blogs. On the kind of longer form side, Power Wars is a terrific book, and there's certainly some kind of covert action, all the decisions around the drone program and the Obama administration's restructuring of the program, and the president's speech on, I think it was May 13th, 2013, if I have that date correct. So that's Charlie Savage is the author of Power Wars, goes through that process in great detail in Power Wars. So it's probably be a good one for you to pick up too. And if you read it, you'll have a leg up if you end up taking my class. So there you go, inside line.
I've got another question here. I will take the very brief part of the beginning part of the answer, and I'm happy to hand you the rest of it. David asks, the Schar School hosts many well-known security professionals, Andrew McCabe, General Mike Hayden, Mike Morrell, David Priest, but will those individuals supervise a student's studies, or will a full-time professor be the student's primary advisor? What I can tell you, our approach at the Schar School, and one of the real strengths of the program, is that we don't have folks like Andrew McCabe in just to tell war stories. There's teaching, there's grading, there's one-on-one sessions. Andrew, could you talk a little bit about what you've learned in your inaugural semester in a professorial role, and what that, what appeals to you about that relationship, and how you might apply some of what you learned this semester to future courses you're going to teach?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the first thing I learned was this is so much harder than I thought it was going to be. It's, war stories are easy, but, and they can be entertaining here and there. But this is like, for me, it was the first time I've been in a classroom in 30 years. So I was a little bit nervous. I can tell you, Travis, I worked so hard on this class every week. Really pouring over the reading cases, case after case after case, trying to figure out how to structure the class in the way that would be most engaging and memorable and, really conducive to a good discussion. I do everything by writing outlines. Again, it's like an old habit. So for each class, I would have these 10, 12, 13 page outlines of the material that I wanted to cover in class. Every class, I always thought I would not have enough content to like cover the whole, 3 hours. And I always ended up just like having to shoehorn the last part of it in because, the discussion was great and I had more than I needed. But so it's a lot of work. It's a lot of preparation, but it's great stuff to read and terrific things to think about. So I really enjoy doing it. So COVID was a bit of an obstacle to having the traditional office hours approach that professors normally have. We couldn't do that. So instead, rather than having like specific hours during the week, I just said to my students that I am absolutely available anytime you want to engage one-on-one, whether it's about a discussion in class, or it's about your final paper or the midterm, or if you want to go over your grade from the midterm, because some people were, had some questions about how they, where they had lost points and that sort of. Happy to do that. Also, just to talk about career opportunities. I had some students who were thinking about going to law school. About half the class probably were looking for or engaged in jobs in government. And so we're interested to talk about kind of career guidance sort of issues. And I'm happy to, to connect with people to talk about any of that stuff. So I did a lot of one-on-one Zoom sessions during the week, just totally informal whenever the schedules worked out. And so that's kind of how I handled that part of it. My students asked if I would leave the Blackboard site up after the class was over so that they could continue engaging kind of with each other in that users group. So that's still up there. I guess at some point I'll probably have to take it down, but I'll leave it up for a while anyway. But yeah, worked out really well.
Great. Got time for a couple more questions. If you want to sneak one in, go ahead. We'll go to a quick one here. Subject matter knowledge and regional expertise can help get you in the situation room. What are some of the skills that help you be not just knowledgeable, but effective when you're in the room? And do you teach some of those skills in class?
Yeah, great question. And I probably don't have enough time to cover it in detail. But first and foremost, like any challenge you'll run into in your professional life, you got to know your stuff. You got to spend the time and the effort getting smart, becoming the expert on whatever the issue is going to be. Second, you have to have the confidence. You have to know your agency, your position, whatever you're representing in that conversation, you have to know it, and you have to have the confidence to speak up and think about your contributions, not as like arguing for victory, but in terms of educating the room. Your goal should be to convey information to decision makers. And ultimately, that's how we get the best decisions out of those exchanges. So it's a tough place to find yourself, especially the first couple times. But if you're there for a reason, and you got to do your job. If you're not doing your job, you're not protecting and representing the American people in the way they expect you to. So yeah, that's how I thought about it.
Alicia asked, are you going to teach this class again? Any thoughts about other courses you might like to teach?
Yeah, great question. I am planning to teach this course again in the spring of 21. So I'm not going to teach this fall, but I will teach this course again in the spring. And I think during the course of the summer and fall, I'm going to start building my next class, which I think I'd really like to do a class that just focuses on terrorism and a little bit more of a deep dive, because that's the subject I love the most. So we'll see. I have to talk to the administration and see what they need first. But yeah, I'm definitely thinking about building out another one.
Great. Just about at time here, but there was a question. Did the 9/11 Commission report change the way that security issues are researched and written about?
I think so. I hope so. I hope that people were smart enough to read the report and kind of really appreciate it for the significant work that it is. It has changed my thinking about intelligence and not even so much intelligence, but like the importance of an after action. It's so, I mean, look, this is what we need right now, right? In the aftermath of the January 6th attack, we should have an absolutely unassailable blue ribbon commission sitting down and looking through every aspect of that experience, and hopefully preparing a similar report so that we know, how did we get in this situation? What should we have done to prevent it? And how should we think about our challenges going forward? I know it's a very different political environment today, and that might be hard to do, but it's absolutely, I think, essential, and I hope we can get that done.
Great. Well, I think we've kind of nailed the timing. We're at 7:01, and Andrew has a hard stop, but you can see him later tonight on CNN, I believe.
Yeah. Sometime in the 8 o'clock hour, I think. I don't know. It may have been. I may have been canceled. I haven't been watching my text very closely.
I really want to thank, on the behalf of the audience and my colleagues at the Schar School, thank you for carving out a little bit of time for us tonight and kind of walking us through your classroom experience, what you're covering, how you engage with the students, what that learning situation is like. Thank you for fielding so many questions. If anyone has any questions about the Schar School, our graduate programs, opportunities to start with us in the fall and the spring, by all means, please email us at schar@gmu.edu, and a member of my team will assist you and connect you with the people and resources that you need to make an informed decision. But we certainly believe that choosing the Schar School is a good one. Any parting wisdom for the group, Andrew?
I've been thrilled to be a part of the Schar School, and it's been a great experience, and the people have been terrific. And so I thank you, Travis, and your team for putting this together. It's always fun to be able to share my kind of excitement and passion about this issue with folks. And so, yeah, think about it. It's a great decision, and one that will make you a better, better equipped to pursue that career that in public service that is so important. So thanks for your interest in the topic, and have a great night.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good night.